All right, this is a demo for our second exercise, which is the shape exercise. The first thing you have to do is find an image you like online that you're going to match the composition of with vector shapes within Photoshop. Then I want you to double click on that image. And because it's online, it's not going to open up in Photoshop, it's going to open up in Preview. But Preview is a very handy little program, especially for viewing reference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it there on the screen, but I'm going to put it in the bottom corner. Okay? And if I want to, I can make it a little bit smaller, just because I want to always know what the image is that I'm working from. Now I'm going to right-click or control-click on that same image on my desktop, and I'm going to open it with Photoshop. Okay. Then I'm going to go to Image, Image Size. And this is our first time looking at image size, but this is where we can tell what the resolution is of the image, and if we need to, we can change it. I am going to force this image up to a bigger resolution, and it's going to distort the image quality because we're asking the pixels to make up lots and lots of information. Computers are amazing tools, but they are not good at making up information. If you don't give it the information, it's just going to be a machine. And so for every pixel that's here, we're going to add another 100 or so pixels around it, which will make it kind of blurry. But there's a reason we're doing this, because we want to be able to print our final product. So I'm going to change the width to 8 inches. Notice I have resample checked, but the width and height are blocked in together. And I'm going to change the resolution from being 72 to being 350. And now you can see how blurry the image is, because those were the pixels in the original image, and when I force the computer to make up so many more, it's like ripples in a pond. Everything's just going to be a lot softer. That's what I want to do. So I changed an image that was only 184 kilobytes. Now it's going to be 26 megabytes. But it's big enough to print, roughly 8 by 10 by 350. All right, so now I need to fit that whole image on the screen, so I'm going to use my shortcut Command 0, and here's the image. It looks very much like my preview image over here, except it's blurrier. Now, on top of this, I'm going to start using shape tools. And so to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is make a new layer, and I'm going to fill that layer in with white. I always like to work on a white piece of paper as my background. So I go up to Edit and Fill, and I'm going to use white on the normal mode at 100%. That gives me a white piece of paper. I'm going to put that behind my layer 0. And if your layer 0 doesn't say layer 0, if instead it says background layer and it's locked, mine doesn't because it's a PNG, then you just want to double click it and rename it layer 0, and it will unlock. Because now I want to take the opacity down to about 50%. Okay? If I turn that white piece of paper off, you'll see the grid coming through showing empty space. Now, that's not great for the colors. The colors you can see here are much more vibrant. But it's very good for getting the shapes. And I want to just start by getting the shapes. So to use these vector tools in Photoshop, what are called shape tools in Photoshop, I go down almost to the very bottom of my tool window where there's a rectangle. And these are the shape tools. And what I'm going to do is start with the biggest basic shape, which is a big oval to my eye. And it will be different for whatever you're drawing. And I'm going to draw that shape, right? And then I can use the Move tool to move that shape around. I can use the Command T that we've learned on the last exercise to rotate it, to warp it, and to make it the shape I want. But because it's the ellipse shape tool, it's always going to be an oval. Okay? If I want to do something more complicated with it in transforming, this is one of my favorite techniques, something more complicated than just rotating and scaling, I control click or right click inside of my transform box, and I'm going to use the warp transform. Now what warp does is it gives me this very simple 9-box grid, and it's like a wireframe, and I can push and pull the shapes within that wireframe. And I want to make this match the arc of that swan's neck. So I'm customizing the shape now. So the warp allows you to customize the shape to almost anything you want. So it's extremely helpful in creating custom kind of vector shapes within Photoshop. Okay, then just like any transformation, to make it permanent, I have to hit return. Now the only problem is I have that shape, it's beautiful, but I can't see anything underneath it and it's not the right color. So I'm not going to worry about that yet. I'm just going to drag that shape underneath my 50% layer, and then I'm going to click back on my 50% layer and do another shape now on top, this time the butterfly. Now the butterfly is more rectangular, or maybe triangular. So I'm going to use a triangle shape. Now there is no triangle under the shape options, but there's what's called the Polygon Tool. And the Polygon Tool will ask you at the top, how many sides do you want your shape to have? So I'm going to say I want it to have 3 sides. Then I'll draw my triangle, right? And it's not so important how it starts. It's important how you transform it. So I hit Command T. I'm going to stretch it. Kind of rotate it where I want it. Now I'm going to do another kind of transformation that's different from warp. I'm going to control click inside, and I'm going to do what's called Distort. And that allows me to kind of drag the points of this triangle anywhere I want. And then if I want it to be curvy, like the butterfly's wings, I can right click and I can then warp within that, and then I can bow out these edges. Your shapes don't need to be perfect, but they need to showcase what you like about the art you're copying. And you'll get a really good feel for the shape tool and the these more complicated transformations through doing it. So I think that shape's going to work pretty well. Now the problem is that shape's the same color as my shape underneath it. So when they're overlaid on top of each other, they just look like one shape. But in my image, the colors are very different. So now how do you change the shape color? If you double click on the layer where you have the shape, it will bring up your color picker. And what you can do is get used to the color slider here and play around with it. You can control what part of the spectrum your color is going to be on this bar here, and then you pick how dark or how light or how saturated it is on this big color field. But the thing that's coolest about this color picker is you can also just steal from your image. So I can actually pick the orange that's right on that butterfly wing, or that moth wing right there. Now I know that my image is artificially pale right now, but that's a good start. So this is what I have so far. Then I'm going to move that underneath, and I'll do another shape. And if I decide I need to tweak the shape a little bit, I can always click on that, transform it again, use the various tools to change it to what I need it to be. Okay, but when I make a new shape, I always want to be on the top layer. So it builds that new shape on the top. So for the back of this butterfly, I'm going to use the ellipse tool again. I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to shrink it. And then I'll use warp to mess with it. But there are limitations to some of these shapes. Let me go to warp here. So it's hard to completely change the shape. And sometimes you'll have to use a more complicated shape than just a basic shape to start with in order to modify it into what you want. And so in that case, I'm going to use what's called the custom shape tool under the shapes. And then you pick from this variety of kind of clip art within Photoshop. Here, I'm going to finish that one off, and then I'm going to pick a color for it. And this color, maybe I'll do more of the yellow. Okay, so let's see what I have now. It's getting there. Okay, now this butterfly shape here, it has a lot of little what are called undercuts. So I could build that with lots of different ovals that I warp, or I can use the custom shape tool. So I go down to the custom shape tool, and up here you'll have your shape options. And this weird little lumpy star is my favorite one to use. So I draw my lumpy star. Whoops. Then I go to the move tool. And I transform it. And I'm going to go right to warp. So I control click and warp within it. Now what you see, all those little squares and dots, those are called anchor points. And that's what lets you know that this is a vector and not a raster-based image. Because vectors are made of anchor points, and then the curves are the straight lines connecting them. And later in the class, we'll learn a lot about a better program for creating vectors and anchor points called Illustrator that Adobe makes. But this shape tool allows us to use them within Photoshop, which is handy, and in some ways a little bit easier at this point in the class. So I'm getting there slowly but surely, making a pretty interesting shape. And I just want to keep working on it. Getting it to kind of represent what I want. Okay, hit return, double click on it. Now to get the color to show up, instead of having to do it as an overlay effect, you don't just double click on the layer, because that will bring up your layer options. And you could put a color in that way using color overlay. But to get the shape color to come up right away, which is more direct, you have to click on the actual image within the layer. And then it will go right to the color picker. And then I can pick on that kind of grayish blue. And I can even exaggerate it a little bit, like so. Okay, the last shape I'm going to do is the beak. So right now I have these 4 shapes together. And the beak, I'm just going to use a straight oval. I always want to be on the top layer before I do it. So it puts the shape on top. And I'm going to use Command T, and I'm going to rotate. I might scale it a little bit, and then I'm going to use Distort this time. to widen the back of the shape.